modify, and improve. And so we found already a very interesting social innovation to escalate learning and knowledge creation on the fly in terms of social movements. You had a form of peer critique as well, but if the code couldn't be read, you couldn't get any useful critique. And perhaps my last almost example has to do with the pro-amateur movement in terms of, in my particular case, astronomy. Now, I bring this up, an idea I first got from Mimi. The word amateur comes from amateur, meaning love. And the catch in this astronomy community is that, in fact, an interesting relationship has emerged between professional astronomers and the amateur ones. Because all of a sudden, the professionals found a reason to interact with the amateurs, because the amateurs were developing kind of very interesting watching or looking practices. And today, to be a hotshot professional astronomer, you traffic in partial differential equations to the globe. You don't actually know much about looking through a telescope. I figured out. But these amateurs know a hell of a lot about how to actually see things through a telescope. There are honest-to-God practices for how you see something through a telescope. This amateur community masters that, and because basically it's a 724 because they have amateurs all over the world. Some of the most important discoveries, even in fundamental physics, have been getting to standard verification of the standard model, comes from the amateurs being able to, in fact, prove when a certain supernova, 1987A, actually the photons hit the Earth because they were monitoring in New Zealand when this happened, taking photographs just before and just after the neutrinos had been detected elsewhere in the world, and that was the missing link in the truth of the standard model. After that happened, the game changed. Professionals suddenly became very interested in mentoring amateurs. A whole new wave of new science started to emerge. And finally, our last example of scalability, an example under development that we may hear just maybe a little bit about later today or tomorrow, comes from Mimi, a whole notion of how giving you kind of mentoring is still so important, maybe will always be so important. How might you actually get scalability in terms of one-on-one virtual mentoring? And she's asked this very provocative question: how do you build really sophisticated matching algorithms? She likes to call it eHarmony applied to truth. That actually knows how to take the particular idiosyncrasies, this student, this kid, and figure out who's the perfect tutor, someplace in the world, a virtual tutor, to work with this kid. And you can see this being developed in things like actually math, where I first saw it happening in chess. I think I got that from Connie, actually, and then StarCraft. But here's an example of saying maybe we have the simplest way to get true
supply chain
one of the most profound kinds of learning you can imagine, that is really skilled mentorship. It is a perfect match between the mental and
look up SAP supply chain.
So let's look, what's the bigger picture? I think the catch is that basically entrepreneurial learners are basically fundamentally makers and thinkers. We tend to underplay just how important this is. Yes, you might say critical thinking is important, but just the make, move, me, and the tinkerers, guess what? They also understand critical thinking. But if you are a maker or you are a tinkerer, guess what? There's a notion of grounded truth. When I build a piece of software, yes, I'm doing it on my own sometimes. Yes, I'm kind of making shortcuts. But the fact is, does this sucker work? This sense of I'm building something doesn't work. That also works in poetry. Does this poem work or not? And so there's a sense of saying it's not just critical thinking that matters, although it's important, but if critical thinking never leads to making something, then the question is, what's the response structure of the thing you just made? So we're kind of finding ways to close that loop as well. I like to think of it as where knowledge and practice meet. So let's step back a moment. Let's look at what you might call a blended epistemology, coming again very much from Montessori. And that is to say, how do we begin to look at ways to combine Homo sapiens, man as knower, with Homo faber, man as maker. The curious thing is, we've always thought about Homo faber as man as maker, maker of things, maker of content. But the game has just changed. Now, today, in the network age, the tools we have at our disposal, we can now not only make things, but we can make contexts. It used to be that basically contexts were stable and recognize the fact that meaning often emerges as much from context as content. And we can start to create contexts, then we have a whole new dimension for creating meaning. We have a whole new way to create meaning. We have a new type of interplay. And in fact, to take a very concrete example of this somewhat obscure metaphysical notion of moving to Homo faber to making context as well as content, of course, in simple terminology, what I just said, this is the essence of remix. What is remix doing? It often is changing the context of a piece of content. Maybe one of the simplest examples is a beautiful exercise that I could actually give you if you will see, is a wonderful exercise for students to think about. Take a movie or a movie trailer, if you want to be legal, and change the music. And guess what? If you change the music, which is the context, to the content of the film, you not only change the music of the film, you actually change what you see. Let me give you a precise example. I'll just suggest you do this, I'm going to tell you to do this. Take Jurassic Park. You all remember that famous scene of the dinosaur chomping their mind? It's one of the most memorable images of that whole movie. I've never left my mind, my memory, whatever. Since I saw that, well, guess what? That never happened. It was still framed very carefully through that, and the critical moment, basically the image vaporizes, and the sound continues. The sound plays with your imagination, and let your imagination construct and fill in the image in a way that you would never think of. A beautiful example of context and content coming together, and was much more dramatic than actually showing the final act. And yet, I swore I saw it. And I really had to go over many times, single frame, because I was so convinced I had seen it. And it just changed it on me or something. But it's an interesting issue of how do you actually kind of think about this rich interplay. And I think what it really gets at, and those of us in other parts of the economy who are going to know more about this, is in this kind of very fluid world of where we can now change contexts. This may be an example of critical thinking is now more important than ever. You have to ask yourself, when you see something, maybe the thing you saw is right, but maybe the context itself has been modified. So how many of you remember the famous pulling of the statue down in the square in the beginning of the Iraq War? Well, guess what? That context had been carefully cropped to get you to believe that those were Iraqis pulling that down. They were Americans. And that's a big thing. Or remember Howard Dean and the scream that caused them to basically lose the election? Well, if you went back to the originals, one of the beauties of actually being at USC, where they have a film school and a communication school, you can find the original shots. Guess what? He was actually talking to the room 3 times as long as this, He couldn't see the back, and he was talking to somebody at the back, and he was actually screaming at the person, at the group at the back. But the press had magically cut that to make it seem like he was going to start. They changed the frame, they changed the context, which completely changed the meaning. So one of the kinds of new types of critical thinking that we have to make sure our students do is, yes, remix is important, but yes, you also begin to realize how through remix you change meaning. And now how do you decide to deconvolve how much of the context has been modified in order to communicate or miscommunicate that point? Blah, blah, blah. So, just say, we used to focus on content. But is also considered belonging. Belonging is in fact, in a very interesting way, constructing the context as much as content. I'm very struck by Andy Sullivan. And he wrote a beautiful article on why I belong. Let me just kind of read a little bit of it. From his point of view, belonging is something that engages, I would call, joint context creation. Let me explain. The blogger, as he said, the blogger is more than any writer of the past, a node among other nodes, connected but unfinished, without the links and the comments and the trackbacks that make the blogosphere at its best a conversation, rather than a production. Jazz, David, listen. Jazz and blogging are intimate, improvisational, and individual, but also inherently collective, and the audience talks over a book. This sense of a new kind of conversation that happens in this joint context construction of an ongoing conversation is a whole new mode of context construction and creation. One last example of this beautiful new book by David Weinberg, Too Big to Know. Think about that. We used to know how to know. Going back to some of the slides on epistemology. We got our answers from books or experts. We nailed down the facts and moved on. We, after all, had canons. But in the internet age, knowledge has moved on to methods. There's more knowledge than ever, but it's different. Topics have no boundaries, and nobody, guess what, agrees on anything. We, as learners, need new strategies and new tools for this world. And a lot of us in this room are here to create those. An interesting notion. We come from our movements 10 years ago in terms of communities of practice. Some of you ladies' beautiful work as well. You might say we learned in order to belong. We learned in order to be able to join a community of practice. We created our identity through learning to join. And that, we believe, is a fundamental force of learning through and for identity construction. Some of us want to argue today that this is slightly changed. But Thomas and myself would like to propose maybe now we belong to learn instead of learning to belong. But it's a different sense of belong. The initial sense of Jean Lay, Nancy Ann Wenger, Paul Duguid, and myself and others, that sense of belonging was to create an identity. Perhaps now we belong to learn. That sense of belonging is a sense of personal agency. We now belong to learn in order to make things actually happen. So I want to kind of just allude to these notions of collectives as a whole new form that we all use in this room as a major source of learning. Collectives are made up of folks who share an individual's personal interests, astronomy, see them all in Facebook groups, etc. But curiously, unlike communities of practice, they make no demands on lectures, no tests, no lectures, yet learning happens all the time. Collectives are focused on enabling individual agency. They are a site for both play and imagination, with the personal and mesh with the collective, transforming and enriching both. So when I go to a collective, I learn something, but I'm expected to contribute something, maybe just to the question that I ask. They have almost unlimited scale via social networks, and at their core rest notions of peer and master mentoring. We have already invented amazing techniques of scale, if you kind of understand this. Sounds cool. On the other hand, in this world of constant change, all these techniques we're talking about, including some aspects of the collective, related to personal and the collective, interact, we still might be just pouring, you might call it, new wine in old bottles. In a constantly changing world, sometimes we must be prepared to craft new bottles as well. It's all too easy to try to use old frames to understand the world today. But if mission features is right, we have to find new ways to regrind our lenses. So simple belief, in a world of constant change, entrepreneurial learners must also be willing to regrind their conceptual lenses. How do you rebuild a conceptual lens? Our argument is play. Play is the essential thing for actually being able to rebuild the lens. That brings us to a third form of epistemology. We talked about Homo sapiens, Homo ludens. Now I want to kind of end with looking at the notion of Homo ludens. Talk about Homo sapien and Homo faber. Now I want to talk about Homo ludens from Johann Hussini. The highly nuanced concept of play. I want to argue that our job, in part, is to go back and reflect on the more nuanced aspects of play. Now, a key aspect of play is not that subtle. It's kind of a permission to fail again and get it right. Meaning, think of how you learn how to think of extreme sports. Failure is a critical part of that learning. But also think about the play of imagination you might employ. How do you kind of tinker with the phrase? Trying one phrase up, another phrase up, another phrase to get that phrase right. And perhaps most importantly, you think about an epiphany. How do you play with something until something just falls in place? Best to say, learning at riddles, leading to a reframing or re-registering of the world, is basically what riddles and epiphanies are about. I mention that because if we can create one epiphany for one child, that epiphany lasts a life for that kid. Brilliant teachers are brilliant in being able to create epiphanies for kids. How do we think about that? And how do we use play as a way to amplify the chance for that to happen? And first, let's look at a very simple example of reframing, and think of the kind of the tension in your own mind. This is a very simple example. And then suddenly how it clicks into place, either by yourself or when somebody shouts out the answer. Now, how you have to play with this idea a little bit in order to figure out how to gel the facts in a new way to suddenly make instant sense of everything that was just said. This is the simplest example. A black dog is sleeping in the middle of a black room that has no streetlights, and by the way, there's no moon. The car coming down the road with its lights on. Magically steers around the dog. How did the driver know the dog was there? They stay fine. I said this is a very simple deal. But there's tension, and then something you play with it. You play with the context part of it, and think, this is trivial. It was daytime, everything falls into place. That is a very simple example. Now let's take yourself into the CIA and think about what the riddles are there and how they have to tinker with the context in order to make sense. We may come back to that. But let's look at these three different epistemologies, knowing, making, playing, and think about how they may be blended together. First of all, in a very simple way, in terms of tinkering. I mean, tinkering brings knowing, making, and playing all together. And in fact, tinkering is catalytic to many kids as a way to kind of understand the moves that are possible. Now, the reason I bring up tinkering in particular is in a world of constant change, if you don't feel comfortable tinkering, you're going to feel an amazing state of anxiety. Because, needless to say, as you saw us here a moment ago, things don't always work. And to hear you have to run and get a manual and figure out how to read exactly what you should be doing and you make a mistake somewhere, then you can't help but be a little bit pissed off. If, on the other hand, you feel completely at home, to say, well, let me kind of play around with the situation a little bit and see if we can kind of make it work. And then you make it work. Not only do you learn something new, but you feel like you are now in control of things. And so the sense of playing in a world of constant change through the lens of tinkering becomes very powerful. But tinkering can be more than just that. It really is a case that if you get skilled at tinkering, you begin to get a gut feeling for how systems work. You get a sense of what can be pushed around. You get a sense of what are the pushbacks all about. You start to develop almost an intimate familiarity with the system itself, the material hand. It is a form of being embodied. You're embodied in kind of a form of embodied immersion, and you start to develop an instinct. And of course, it's deeply situated. So there's a kind of a deep structure type of tinkering that I think we're now looking at that leads to this reframing that is completely aligned with this sense of the epiphany stuff. And how do you kind of play with really radically changing the context that start to build new lenses that you can use. So I would want to suggest that if you look at the world through most schooling systems today, if you look at the weighting of influence, homo sapien is way up here, homo formis sometimes sneaks in at the edge, and homo ludens, or play, usually gets wiped off the screen. But if you look at the shifts that every one of us in this room kind of already lives daily, we've moved from a world of knowing just what, but perhaps even more important, knowing where. Where do you find what you need? How do you tinker with an effort to find what you need if you don't know exactly where it is? And thinking has moved, as I said, making has moved from just making things to things in context, and playing now has as much to do with sensing. How do I play with the situation and make sense out of it when I talked about this kind of deep structure tinkering? So I want to suggest that the world we're actually moving into, and the tools that we want to build, the institutions we want to create, the different types of connections we want to make, the different types of institutions that already make up our context, and maybe make some new institutions, really says, how do we get a more balanced structure between knowing, making, and playing? Homo sapiens, homo property, homo ludens. And think about this in terms of riddling and world building. How do you actually start to kind of build new worlds with the network tools that we actually have, which is the deepest kind of tinkering. And I say that in some deep ways, in terms of the crisis of imagination or thinking about imagination, you know, the catch, and this comes back to working intelligence as well, how do you take something that's really strange and construct a world so that this strange event suddenly makes a lot of sense in the world? That is what Harry Potter's books are about. Taking the wand, the magic wand, that seems in some sense so strange, operates in a world of no electricity. How can that be? And now a world gets constructed for you through the novel, through the set of novels, where this strange idea seems so obvious you never thought it could be strange. I want to suggest that we have to go back and think much more about the tools today for building worlds that completely change the notion of code, change the world of games, and change a lot of things about how you think about world building, such that I can take a strange event and make it seem so natural. And in fact, some of the deepest challenges we have in intelligence is how do you take some strange event and let me construct a set of scenarios, a set of personal motivations, etc., that take that strange event and say, well, how else could it be? When we can do that, we may finally begin to understand parts of the world that seem so mysterious to us today. And this suggests that the real being that we have today is network games, with new notions of networks and imagination. How do we amplify our ability? Through kind of emergent collective action, and we see many examples of collective action, to create a sense of shared imagination. The reason I personally bring this up is because I was one of the original people that argued back in a long time ago, that communities of practice have to have a sense of co-presence. If they're going to be distributed, we tended to call them networks of practice. But possibly, just possibly, and you see developing in some of the game worlds as well, and some of these imagined worlds that we start to construct. I can construct jointly with people around the world a shared imagination that makes me feel totally co-present in the mental space with the others. There's something very powerful at stake here that I'm only beginning to unpack now. So let me just kind of say, repeating myself, that in a world of constant change, entrepreneurial learners must be willing to regrind our conceptual lenses with which we make sense. And play is essential, but the key part of play is the space of safety and permission. What kinds of permission do we give our students today? What kinds of permission are required for the tools we're talking about to really have that power? What types of institutional innovations do we need to think about to grant those types of permissions in order to be playful in this deep epistemological sense? I was going to end, but there was a brief epilogue. And you need, I don't want to teach you what I should do. This is a talk, not a book. But 2 slides on epilogue. I like to think about back to the future, again in terms of Montessori, maybe even predating Montessori. Some of the greatest learning environments are actually the one-room schoolhouse. Why were they so effective? It's because the teacher wasn't transferring knowledge, but the teacher was acting as a coach, a coordinator, a mentor, getting older kids to spend some time helping younger kids. So the kids, older kids were teaching younger kids, and then the younger kids would turn around and also teach the younger kids. It was an amazing social dynamic in that classroom. And the teacher was responsible for orchestrating that amazing ability to learn and to teach simultaneously by each student in that class. Now, I want to leave us with one simple challenge. Because to understand the social and psychodynamics of how that classroom works, and the skills that teacher brought to the surface. By the way, that teacher was not a master of the material, but a master of the way that kids thought, the fears they had, how to read them, couple them with their interests, and so on and so forth. But now, let us ask, is it possible we're getting into to take the one-room schoolhouse and make it the global one-room schoolhouse through these networks of imagination and new forms of mentorship? Thank you.
That was just a warm-up. Are you ready to do your real talk now? That would be nice. Well, great. Thank you. So, really, I don't have a time to